right, we're in 2 Kings chapter 9. 2 Kings chapter 9. We're looking at, we've been introduced to Jehu, and he's going to execute the promise that God made to Elijah about 10 to 12, well, maybe a little more than 10 to 12, maybe 15 years ago, in 1 Kings 19. And so what we've seen is he's obviously a general in the army of the king of Israel, and one of the sons of the prophets, that is, one of the younger prophets who studied in that school, went to anoint him as king over Israel. And he does that in private, and the men who serve with Jehu accept, obviously, his position. There was probably a lot of discontent with the king who was currently in control at the time. And then where we left off, I think we were supposed to pick up in 27. But to kind of put that back in its context, Jehu kills the king of Israel and the king of Judah. You remember one was wounded during the battle at the end of 2 Kings 8. And so they're recovering together. Jehu comes, and then the king of Israel sends out messengers. And the messengers basically, Jehu tells them to get in line or else. And so they get in line. And so the king of Israel is killed, and that is to repay, to fulfill the prophecy of Elijah, but also to repay Ahab and Jezebel their house for killing the prophets of God, for killing Naboth. And we closed out looking at the importance of when he said at the end of 26, I will repay you on this plot of ground, that is to make peace. And we talked about the way that idea works with blood and covering and justice and life for life and things along those lines. And so where we pick up now is Ahaziah, king of Judah, saw this. That is, he saw the king of Israel killed, and he fled in the direction of Beth-Hagan. And Jehu pursued him and said, shoot him also. And they shot him in the chariot at the ascent of Gur, which is by Abalim, which is about halfway between Jezreel and Samaria. So he runs for a little while. He makes a pretty good dash for it, but eventually they catch him and kill him. And he fled to Megiddo and died there. His servants carried him, in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in the tomb of his fathers in the city of David. In the 11th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, Ahaziah began to reign over Judah. So the king of the south is also killed. Now, this wasn't necessarily a part of the original proclamation. And so there are two ideas of what could be going on here. Number one, it could be that Jehu's stepping over the line. He certainly does step over the line in some places. And Hosea chapter 1, that's exactly what it said. His house has got to be destroyed because he went too far. And I guess it wasn't last week because we sang last week, didn't we? The week before, we talked about that. The Bible is very concerned with making sure that the punishment is proportionate to the crime. Number one, because it robs the individual of their dignity, and it also teaches us when we can berate an individual and we can hurt an individual, we lessen the value of human beings in our own eyes. And that's something that, although we may be executing it toward a criminal, it won't be long before that attitude takes over and we start executing that, and we have no pity on anyone else either. And so God is very concerned that justice be meted out, but at the same time there are limits to it. You can't just do what you want to do, and you can't just do what was done to you, okay? And that depends on the circumstances. I understand the law said eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, wound for wound, but that was in a different context of not necessarily a life of a capital offense where life was to be taken for a crime. That was the idea of exacting justice for injuries that took place. And so we have to be sure that when we're holding those verses, we hold them in tension and make sure that we keep them in their context. So when he comes here and he shoots the king of Judah, so one school of thought is that Jehu went too far. The other school of thought is that he killed him correctly because at the end of chapter 8, you remember this whole time we've been talking about the kings of Israel, the kings of the north, and then all of a sudden in chapter 8 we talk about the kings of Judah again, which is somewhat strange. And what we're told about them is that they started intermarrying with Ahab's family in the north. And so to execute all of Ahab's descendants, you could make an argument that in a way you would have to kill some of the people in the south too, because of their relationship with him. And so either way, and we'll get into that more when we get into chapter 11, when Athaliah begins to kill, move and go on a genocide or seeking to kill all of a royal family in Judah. But anyway, that's where we are in this. Now, a couple things of note. One in particular that I want to zero in on. It says, when the king Ahaziah was shot, he fled to Megiddo and he died there. Okay? What I want to zero in on there for a second is Megiddo. So, how many people have heard of the Battle of Armageddon? Pretty much everybody? Okay. Now, on the whole, I'm going to guess if what we've heard about Armageddon probably comes from popular level teaching. And that is what you hear from people who are strongly and deeply premillennial. If that is our idea of the Battle of Armageddon of Megiddo, we need to delete and empty the trash bin, because it's not what it's about. Armageddon, spoken of in the book of Revelation, is a reference to the place, the battlefield of Megiddo. Okay? Now, in our text here, you see him fleeing to Megiddo, a stronghold. And all throughout the Old Testament, we don't have the time to trace it tonight, obviously, but all throughout the Old Testament, we could go on battle after battle after battle after battle after battle. Megiddo was a well-known battlefield because it was an open area where battle could be waged. John picks up on that imagery in Revelation to describe spiritual warfare. He has no intention of saying there's going to be an end times battle on the place of Megiddo. When my dad was in school, one of the papers that he wrote was addressing the Battle of Armageddon, in which he took the math that was spoken of in Revelation and the premillennial idea, the amount of people that are involved, supposedly going to be involved in this battle, and he proved mathematically that it was impossible to do what it was that premillennialists were saying it was to do, where the horse would rise up to the bridle, or the blood would rise up to the horse's bridle. He calculated the amount of blood in the human body, the amount of people alive on the earth, and showed it literally to be impossible to do that. You can't kill enough people. You can't drain enough blood to do it. Megiddo is something that when we're familiar with the Old Testament, it's an imagery of warfare. But John picks up on all these Old Testament images, and his idea is not saying that, okay, we're going to go to war at the end of time and we're going to fight each other on a foreign battlefield somewhere. He's using the common notion and understanding of the plain of Megiddo, where battles were fought, to illustrate that there is a battle between good and evil. That there's a battle between, and that battle, by the way, is not at the end of time. It's waging war right now in the book of Revelation as the people are reading it. It's not an end times battle. It's an ever-present one. And one that Jesus ultimately wins in Revelation chapter 19. So, I wanted to point that because, just kind of put it on your radar, because Revelation is coming up for us. We're going to get there, hopefully. And that's one of the reasons I chose 1st and 2nd Kings before we got there, was because we're going to see a lot of this stuff again. And it's going to come back up, and Megiddo is going to be one of those. And one of the things you'll learn quickly, too, is the amount of attention people give to the Battle of Armageddon is disproportionate to the amount of attention that God gives to it. What do I mean by that? God spends a paragraph about this big talking about it. We got people writing books that are this big. It's like the 1,000-year reign of Revelation chapter 20. There are people writing books this big. It's one verse in Revelation chapter 20. One. We have to be cautious when we're looking at that, but all that will be fun when we get to it. So, Megiddo is that place. Now Jehu is going to continue to execute the family of Ahab, and he's going to move on to Jezebel. So verse 30, when Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out of the window. So she puts her makeup on, she gets her royal attire on, and she knows that he's coming. Now there are a couple of different ideas here. What is she actually doing by getting dressed up? Some people think that she's trying to seduce Jehu in a way. I think that's probably a little off base in my opinion. I don't think she's trying to do that. I think what she's doing is adorning herself in her royal apparel so that in her mind she kind of dies with honor. She's the true royal. And what she's going to say here to Jehu is, you're an imposter. You don't actually belong in royalty. And my family, who you're seeking to kill, we're the ones who are really royal. It's kind of like a slap in the face toward Jehu to kind of, I'm better than you. I'm actually royalty, not you. And no matter what you do to me, that won't change. You'll always be considered an imposter. So, in verse 31, it says, and Jehu entered the gate. She said, is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master? Now notice, what is she saying here when she says, you Zimri? That's not his name. Jehu's his name. So what's she saying? 1 Kings 16, Zimri was a person who overthrew another king in another dynasty in 1 Kings chapter 16. So when she calls him Zimri, she's saying you're an imposter. She's, to the very end, she's hurling insults and just being a downright mean person. That's all she is. When people are mired in their sinfulness and their rebellion, they can get to a point where they don't really change. They've chosen this way of life and they're going to choose it to the end. And really, eternity is not going to change them. Hell is not even going to change them. Some people look at hell as if it's some kind of a reformatory. Like you go there and then all of a sudden people who were wicked they'll know that they were wrong, but that doesn't change that they're still going to be as arrogant and as difficult as they were in life. If you look closely at Luke 16 with the rich man and Lazarus, what does the rich man do? When he lifts up his eyes, so beforehand, while he's alive, he pays no attention to those who are in need. He only worries about himself. Everything is about him. And when he dies, he does the exact same thing. Why? Look at it. Pay close attention to it. Send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. Send him back to my father's house, not to all of Israel, not to all the people who are in need, but send him back to my father's house. He doesn't change. He is who he's been all along. So, some people, when they get to that point, when they've chosen that, they're still going to be high-handed and rebellious. And that's what she's doing here. She regrets nothing. She apologizes for nothing. She doesn't think she's done anything wrong. How do you deal with a person like that? You got to learn to let it go. We don't do what Jehu does. People say, well, Jehu killed her. Yeah, but he was under direct orders to do so. You and I aren't. Okay? So, here she is. Then Jehu just does something simple. He actually doesn't, I guess, technically kill her in this sense. Verse 32, he lifted up his voice to the window and said, who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. And so it's kind of a funny picture because she's inside this palace and she's calling out to him, insulting him, maybe standing in a window or something. And then he knows that where she is, eunuchs or servants are going to be. And so he says, who's on my side? And you kind of see 2 or 3 guys that she has probably mistreated wildly in the years that they have worked for her. And they just kind of stick their head out and go, yep, what you need me to do. He said, throw her down. So they threw her down. And some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled on her. Then he went in and ate and drank. The idea, so what he's doing when he just kind of basically steps over the whole situation and goes about eating and drinking is no big deal. I'm the king. She's dead. It's another day at the office. But it's really what she did, right? She killed prophets and went on and ate. She killed Naboth, went on and ate, did whatever she wanted to do. This is what she always did. So then in 34 again, it says, and he said, see now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. Now what's interesting is in verse 10, God strictly said, and none shall bury her. That was part of the prophecy. So Jehu kind of deviates there a little bit. But of course, as we're going to see, there's nothing to bury anyway, so it doesn't matter. But when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. And when they came back and told him, he said, this is the word of the Lord which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the territory of Jezreel, the dog shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be dung on the face of the field in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say, this is Jezebel. No sight, no royal burial. That prevents you from building a shrine. Why is it that the standard American policy right now, or it has been in the last 10, 20 years of the war on terror, the standard policy is that terrorist leaders, you bury them at sea. Because if you bury them somewhere in the ground and people find out, it becomes a shrine and it has a backfire effect. So you bury them at sea. Nobody can find them. Nobody can create a shrine. I mean, I guess you could try out in the middle of the ocean. I just don't think it's going to work. So when Jezebel is gone here, it prevents the ability anyone to create a shrine to her and to her memory. Now, you had the tombs of the prophets. You had the tombs of David and all of the royal family in Jerusalem. And so God wasn't opposed to that type of a thing. But here he refuses to let Jezebel have that. And she is basically consumed, eaten by dogs or... you have to remember, dogs in this time, so they were used in a couple of different ways. There were little dogs like you keep at home inside your house. And I'm speaking generally. I know some people keep big dogs inside. Doesn't matter. Generally, you kept little dogs inside as pets. Big dogs kind of just roamed the streets. They were your scavengers. They were like raccoons or something. That's why Jesus says in Matthew 7, don't take what is holy, don't cast your pearls before swine, and don't feed that which is holy to the dogs. Stuff that is reserved for the holy shouldn't be given to scavengers. The two don't mix. Okay? So, that's what he's doing here, and Jezebel meets her end in a very ugly way, but also a fitting way. Because this is who she was and how she treated others. All right. So he's started cleaning house a little bit. He's got the current king and he's got the queen mother. And now he's going to move to the rest of the people who could claim the throne in chapter 10. So verse 1. Now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. So Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the rulers of the city, to the elders, and to the guardians of the sons of Ahab, saying. So 70 sons. One of the things to keep in mind here, is it possible that Jehu had literally 70 sons? Yes, it's possible. Okay? That kind of stuff is not uncommon even in the Middle East today. Okay? And it wasn't uncommon for a king to have multiple wives and a harem. Okay, the Bible doesn't deny that. Jezebel is just mentioned because of her influence. It doesn't mean she was the only wife Ahab had, most likely. It's just she influenced him so much, she gets attention by the writer of the Kings. So, it's possible that he had 70 sons. It's also possible that this is a little bit more all-encompassing, right? So, they didn't necessarily think about the way they understood these terms were more fluid than you and I would think of them. When I say I have 3 sons, I mean I literally have 3 of them. Same is true with however you want to put that. This is my dad, this is my granddad, this is my great-granddad. But to them, those words were a little more elastic. That's why you'll see, we've already seen it in the King's some. We'll see it a little bit more as we pick up throughout the rest of the Kings, that someone might be called a person's father. His father reigned before him. But in actuality, he's really his grandfather or his great-grandfather. Okay? So the words kind of more encompassing. So sons here could mean not just the literal sons, but also anybody that's kind of directly just like grandsons, or anybody that could have possibly laid a legitimate claim to the throne at some point. I mean, 70, that's a long line of succession, but it's still possible, okay? They still have that traced out. And so what he's doing here now is basically going after every male possibility that could even claim the throne as an heir. And so he writes a letter to the elders in Samaria. And this is what he says in the letter, verse 2. It says, "Now then, as soon as this letter comes to you, seeing your master's sons are with you, and there are with you chariots and horses, fortified cities also, and weapons, select the best and the fittest of your master's son to set him on his father's throne and to fight for your master's house." So what's Jehu saying here in the letter? What's he calling them to do? I'm sorry? Making the new king. What he's calling for is war. Let's see. I'm claiming to be king. You set up who you think the best heir of Ahab is, and let's go meet in war. And we'll see who wins. So, verse 4, "But they," that is the elders of Samaria, "were exceedingly afraid and said, Behold, the 2 kings could not stand before you. How then can we stand?" You can't blame them. They're sitting here going, "You've already killed a king in Israel and a king in Judah. We don't stand a chance." So, he who was over the palace and he who was over the city, together with the elders and the guardians, sent to Jehu, saying, "We are your servants, and we will do all that you tell us. We will not make anyone king. Do whatever is good in your eyes." Then he, that is Jehu, wrote to them a second letter, saying, "If you are on my side, and if you are ready to obey my voice, take the heads of your master's sons, and come to me at Jezreel tomorrow at this time." Now the king's sons were 70 persons, were with the great men of the city who were bringing them up. Now I want you to think about what Jehu said. Bring with you the heads of the 70 sons. You see, politics, they don't change. And one of the things you need if you're going to be a skilled politician and you're trying to get some things done is something called plausible deniability. What does he say? Bring the heads of the 70 sons. Now, how do you take that? There's not a wrong answer. How could you read it? You can read it, kill them. But you could also do what? Just bring them. There's nothing about whether or not the head is detached or not. It just says bring the heads. And so Jehu can look at it, and he's going to in just a minute. He can look at it and say, "Look, I didn't kill them. I didn't tell them to take their heads off. I said bring their heads. I didn't say anything about detaching them from their body. See that technicality and that plausible deniability stuff? Yeah. It's dumb, but yet so many people do it. Plausible deniability is something that cowards do when they're afraid to make a decision and stand by. So verse 7, as soon as the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and slaughtered them, 70 persons, and put their heads in baskets, and sent them to him in Jezreel. When the messenger came and told him, they have brought the heads of the king's sons, he said, lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning. So just pile them up. So basically 35 heads on one side, 35 heads on the other. Kind of as a warning. And this has been done throughout history, that you hang corpses or body parts or things along this line out in the public for people to see, kind of a warning against rebellion or something along whatever might be going on at the particular time. Verse 9, he says, then in the morning when he went out, he stood and said to all the people, you are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him. But who struck down all of these? You see, it's a very sly, very Machiavellian. You know, Machiavelli is the guy that most politicians kind of hold up as the high level, an Italian guy who wrote a book on politics. And, I mean, people say he kind of wrote the book. I think sinful people have been doing the same thing for years. He just kind of became famous for it. I mean, but a lot of our modern politicians are very Machiavellian. If you study his philosophy, you study the way he said you should get laws passed and things done, like our politicians follow him to a T, on both sides of the aisle, by the way. So he says here, I killed him. So I'm taking credit. I will admit that I killed the king. But somebody else killed the sons. Now what is he doing? He's not just creating deniability, he's creating a political picture. And what he's doing by saying somebody else, and especially here the elders killed the sons, you see, I did kill the king, but this is something everybody's been unhappy with the whole family for a long time. And so this is not just a one person trying to take over. It's actually a movement that everybody's kind of behind. It's not just like one lone ranger out here. He's a pretty smooth politician. Pretty smooth about framing things. What he's doing here is not too far off even a modern political concept called the Overton window. You ever heard the phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste? That's the Overton window. You exploit a tragedy to push your agenda. He's actually not too far off right here. And so he's kind of painting himself in a way that makes him maybe not as culpable, and people seem more likely to follow him in the end because it seems like this was something that was just coming. Verse 10, it says, Know then that there shall fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done what he said by his servant Elijah. None of it fell to the earth. Similar phrases used in 1 Samuel 3:19 about Samuel and his prophetic ministry, that none of his words fell to the ground. The idea is that they go forth and they, kind of like shooting an arrow, they hit their target. They happen. They fulfill. They don't ever just miss target and fall to the ground, is kind of the idea. So, verse 11, Jehu struck down all who remained in the house of Ahab and Jezreel, all his great men and his close friends and his priests, until he left none remaining. Then in verse 12, he set out and went to Samaria. On the way, when he was at Beth-Eked of the shepherds, Jehu met the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and he said, Who are you? And they answered, We're the relatives of Ahaziah, and we have come down to visit the royal princes, the sons of the queen mother. he said, take them alive, and they took them alive and slaughtered them in the pit, at the pit of Beth Eked, 42 persons, and he spared none of them. So there are a couple things going on here. Beth Eked is around Dothan, which is where Elisha was in 2 Kings chapter 6. They say they're the relatives of the king of Judah, and they're going to check on him. Okay, so there are a couple different ideas here. Number one, does Jehu cross a line by killing these people? I think there's a plausible argument there. But there are also some things that are suspect about what they're doing. Because Beth Eked is north of Samaria. Why would descendants and people from the house of Judah be coming to Samaria from the north? The descendants of Judah, if this is Palestine, the descendants of Judah are from down here. Samaria is here. Why would they come to Samaria from here down? Doesn't make sense. So the other plausible theory is that these people are actually imposters and on their way to maybe create some trouble for Jehu. And they're posing as part of the royal family in the south. I don't know. Doesn't really change either way. But both of those things are plausible. And so, any questions or anything on those? We'll stop there and pick up at 15 when we're back together. Any questions or anything on those?